Hey, want to hear something creepier than all of Edgar Allan Poe's stories combined? Edgar was 26 years old when he married his first cousin, who was 13 years old at the time. Ooh. In all seriousness, Edgar Allan Poe was a literary master and you should all read his work. He is unmatched in setting, tone, poetic phrasing, and he writes like a god. One of those ancient Greek or Norse gods who had weird approaches to sex and romance. But we're all liberal here, aren't we? We can forgive him for... Actually, no we can't. 13 is too damn young. Edgar, you are a creepy motherfucker. Halloween is a holiday celebrated by children who, contrary to all notions of horror, dress up as goblins and pixies and run from house to house gathering tooth dissolvers. And I can't help but think that we have, no pun intended, sugar-coated our culture when children are perfectly comfortable to venture out at night during a holiday dedicated to the concept of horror. In fact, doesn't this background look a little too cheery for the season? I better change this. There, that's better. One of my favourite stories by Poe is The Pit and the Pendulum, which is a bit of a mouthful for a title. I'm abbreviating it. TPATP stars a nameless, faceless dude with no specific background and no personality beyond being terrified at his predicament, who gets his ass jailed by a set of corrupt judges for an unspecified crime that he may or may not have committed. It's sort of like the stock introduction to every Elder Scrolls game ever. Our hero, whom I shall name Blank Slate because that's exactly what he is, faints from terror in the courtroom upon hearing the verdict of death and wakes up to find himself inside a pitch-black chamber. He tries to get his bearings inside the chamber by following the walls with his hands in one of the few cases in all of English literature where words alone can instill a feeling of claustrophobia. Blank Slate wanders around in total darkness for a while before he almost, but doesn't quite, fall into a pit. Had he fallen into the pit, he would have probably bounced off the stone walls a couple times down his narrow descent, breaking his bones and twisting his joints before splashing into the water at the bottom and then drowning. Or, if he managed to avoid drowning, hypothermia or exhaustion, and then drowning. Blank Slate's narration here attempts to draw uneasiness and fear from lamenting how close he came to dying horribly. But so far in the story, we've only covered one half of the title, so the next trap that Blank Slate is subjected to is the pendulum. Blank Slate wakes up to find himself not in total darkness, but in a lit chamber where way above him there is a pendulum swinging. But the weight on the pendulum is actually a giant blade that inches lower and lower towards Blank Slate with every single swing. Now the terror here is almost entirely in juxtaposition to the terror induced in the last scene. Blank Slate only knew of the pit's existence after he managed to avoid falling into it, and so the terror was entirely retrospective, focusing on what could have happened. By contrast, Blank Slate can easily see the pendulum well before it comes close to slicing him up. The subsequent fear is drawn from the next few hours, or however long he's tied down for, watching the pendulum get closer and closer to his chest. Blank Slate's predicament actually gets rather psychological, as he has plenty of time to think over the fact that he's about to die and there's nothing he can do to stop it. TPATP is an interesting specimen because it's all about time. The first part of the story with the pit entails horror in the notion of what could have just happened, the horror of the immediate past, and the pendulum entails horror in the notion of what is about to happen, the horror of the immediate future. So the story as a whole is all about immediacy, living, or in this case dying, in the moment. As far as the reader is concerned, there is no world outside the chamber. Remember, Blank Slate doesn't have a backstory, he's not thinking about future goals, he doesn't have any family, friends, relations, hobbies, quirks, or anything to his character other than the fact that he's probably about to die in a fucking gruesome way. And as shocking as this is going to sound to anyone watching who places value in characterization as the central component of any story's engagement to the audience, you know who you are, this lack of character and context is this short story's greatest strength. Let's take a look at the two other prominent types of horror fiction. The first is the kind I like, old-school horror that focuses more on concepts than actual danger. The two obvious examples are Frankenstein and The Call of Cthulhu. If you've watched my videos on these, then you'll note that both of these stories, for the most part, don't generate horror through having characters in danger. Danger is certainly present to some of the characters in the narrative, however, it's not why we are here. Frankenstein horrifies us by breaking down the barrier of human identity by showing us a distinctly non-human being who shows stronger human traits than us humans and yet is rejected by human society due to distasteful superficial appearance. The Call of Cthulhu horrifies us by proposing the existence of a race of gods beyond human understanding, the existence of which invalidates the supposed significance of human beings in the grand scheme of the universe. Both of these concepts don't directly affect human safety, but rather generate horror by attacking our identity as a species. The other type of more modern horror fiction is character-based horror. See, anything that Stephen King has ever written, or any horror movie that Hollywood has ever produced. This kind of horror works by taking a character, having the audience empathize with them, and then putting the character in a horrifying situation. Since we empathize with the character, we are horrified at their horrific demise. In character-based horror, the characters we are supposed to empathize with have personalities, goals for the future, and backstories, so in fact they do something similar to old-school horror in a way, by playing off of human identity. However, instead of challenging human identity, they exploit it by making a human character the audience can either identify or empathize with, and then slaughtering them. The Pit and the Pendulum does neither of these things. It forgoes context by having a minimal setting and never focusing on anything outside of the immediate present, and it forgoes character by casting in the role of protagonist a nameless, faceless blank slate with no real personality, backstory, or future to speak of, so it cannot be the style of horror that scares by invoking a disturbing philosophy or concept, nor the style of horror that scares by playing off of human empathy. No. TPATP strips the horror genre down to its uttermost basic and invokes an incredibly simple yet incredibly powerful fear, the fear of death. In fact, you can see this theme in the opening scene of the story when, if you'll recall, Blank Slate faints out of sheer terror upon hearing his death sentence. Now, I can already hear the tip-tapping of computer keys, and my supernatural powers of clairvoyance tell me that several of you are probably going to comment something like, "But all horror uses the fear of death. Humans are naturally afraid of death. This story by literary master Edgar Allan Poe isn't doing anything in particularly special in that regard." And you bring up a good point, which is why I would like to give you my preemptive answer to that comment. Media consumers, after consuming enough media, get desensitized to fiction. I know that the death of a character in a novel isn't anything to cry about because no real person has actually died. Think about how many times you've read, watched, or played through a death scene in fiction and haven't felt any grief towards the dying character. At all. This is because in fiction, the idea of death alone isn't enough to generate an emotional response from the audience. It has to be contextualized. For the most part in media, the context surrounding a meaningful death is enormous. Writers provide mountainous piles of reasons for why the audience should cry over the fake death of a fictional character, and in this way it really isn't the death that affects us. It's loss or hopelessness or being confronted with our own mortality or something else, the implications of death rather than the death itself. Edgar Allan Poe's achievement in The Pit and the Pendulum is that he has presented the idea of death with virtually no character and next to no context, and yet still generates a feeling of horror from the audience. But this time it isn't horror at the deconstruction of human identity, nor is it the horror at the loss of a beloved character. It is purely the horror of death. Well, okay. Blank Slate manages to escape in the end, but when you think about it, that helps to reinforce the death concept. Since Blank Slate doesn't die, we aren't horrified by his death, but by the prospect of death. Here's a challenge to all of you Halloween celebrators for when you are reading horror books, watching horror movies, and playing horror games. When you feel horrified, ask yourself if you would be equally as horrified had the moment been stripped of all context and character, and if you don't think it would, think back to The Pit and the Pendulum. Happy Halloween, everyone!